Welcome to the Deal by Me podcast, where we ask guests to tell us your story. Hello there, this is Dr. James W. Smith, your host. We seek to transform lives by encouraging and inspiring. Someone encouraged and inspired this host, a former lawyer, gambler, inmate, and his life was transformed. The same can happen to you. So when you listen to any of the Deal by Me podcasts, please support this podcast with a donation or a monthly recurring amount for as little as $3. If you're viewing any of the podcasts on YouTube, please subscribe. To supporters of this podcast, we say thank you. Check out my encouraging, inspiring, and transforming books. I'm available for speaking engagements, in person and virtual seminars, so please contact me through my website, www.dealbyme.com. I have with me Tonya Cunningham, who is not only a leading expert in grief counseling, but also a compassionate guide for those navigating the tumultuous waters of loss. She has dedicated her career to helping individuals cope with grief and find their way to healing. Dr. Tonya has been a beacon of hope for many. I'm going to let her share as we dialogue together more about what she does. And I'm trusting listeners of this podcast will truly enjoy the interview. And I'm happy to have Dr. Tonya come and share with us on this podcast. Um, Dr. Tonya Cunningham, would you share with guests, with listeners of this podcast, a little bit about yourself and where you are located as the interview is being taken place?
Well, sure. Thank you so much. I want to say that to you. Thank you for
Thank
allowing
you.
me to be your guest today. And I hail from Fort Worth, Texas,
Okay.
born and raised. And I have been in this industry, the death care industry, for 35 years.
Hmm.
That has afforded me the opportunity to really accompany many, many people upon their healing journey. And what I really discovered is that most people don't understand what grief is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as a result of that, I am passionate about helping people really transform. I use that as well, transform from loss to life and from pain to purpose, and to really recognize there is life after loss, is just a different one.
Well, Dr. Cunningham, I, with a little humor right now,
Uh-huh.
I'm going through a little grief right now after the election, so
Oh, yeah,
we can talk about that later. Okay.
it is true. Many people are. That is a very real response.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I have I've read your bio and very interesting, fascinating. I love what you do.
Thank you.
It's something that I admire in people who are able to just help people get through certain situations in their lives. And obviously, grief is a real situation that most of us at one point of our lives will deal with at some point. We'll deal with it.
Absolutely.
So, how can you talk to me a little bit about it? So, I want you to kind of ask me what in what is it that inspired you to become a grief coach, and how has your approach uh, kind of evolved over the time? Because I heard you say you've been in it for uh, 30 some years, I believe.
Mm,
I heard that.
absolutely.
Okay.
Mhm.
So talk a little bit about that so that listeners of this podcast can get a good feel for where you are.
Mhm. I believe it was a call to this type of work.
Okay.
Most people don't wake up. Actually, I started out as a mortician, and that was
Hmm.
back in the late 80s. And that was during a time when women, and definitely women of color, we were not as prevalent in the field as they are today.
Mm-hmm.
So I started out in that aspect, and my mother, I attribute it to her to remove the fear of death and dying because she took me to funerals. And
Mm-hmm.
it just sparked this intrigue in me. So I started, graduated from mortuary school, went back and taught a few years ago. But I evolved when I was teaching there because I was teaching the course grief psychology. And I was scared as a new professor teaching, and students would walk out of my class, James, and I was scared. I'm like, oh my gosh, I would go talk to my president at the time. I say, I don't
Mm-hmm.
think I'm good at this teaching thing.
Mm-hmm.
He said, why? I said, because the students are getting up and walking out and they're crying. And he said, it's not because of you, it's the subject that you're teaching, the grief psychology. So we had students who were coming to be a funeral director and an embalmer who had not dealt with their grief.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to where I am today. This evolution took place because I was that person too. And the challenge is I didn't realize it. So I taught grief, but I did not apply it properly.
Mm-hmm.
I allowed my culture, which is the Black community, Black faith community, we have a tendency to spiritualize everything. And so that's what I did. And I did not deal with the emotions of it. It was a
Wow.
divorce. Yeah.
Wow.
So I buried my baby, my mother, my father, and my mentor was brutally murdered 3 days before my wedding. He was also my wedding coordinator. And
Mm.
then in 2020, during the pandemic, I had 9 losses, but I spiritualized every one of them.
Mm.
Every one of them. It was a divorce that
Yeah,
opened my eyes.
I pastored for 32 years, just retired at the end of 22
Hmm.
from the same church, and I mean, gave eulogies for I don't know how many people, and
Yeah.
for the last 14 months, I've been serving as an interim pastor at my home church, who lost their pastor, preached on a Sunday, and that Monday had a heart attack. So, and I during the last 14 months, as a matter of fact, within the last 2 months, I have attended, preached two of the deacons' funerals, and of course, attended and presided at I think three other funerals within the last 2 3 months. So,
Wow.
I know what it is, and what you are deal with, and how
Hmm.
you have to work people through this. Because I'm not a. I tell them all the time that when it gets too tough for me, I have to tell them about who they need to see,
That's right.
who they need to
That's
see.
right.
So, but I'm always interested in it. So, tell me some of the challenges that individuals face when they're dealing with grief, and how can they overcome these
Hmm.
challenges. You obviously been in it long enough. You can kind of talk
Hmm.
to listeners, and kind of take them through this.
Absolutely. The number one challenge that I am faced with when I'm working with people, it sounds simple, but it is so profound. It's just acknowledging that you're in grief.
Mm, okay.
Many people will say, I'll hear of a loss that they've experienced. I say, how are you doing since the death of such and such? Oh, I'm good. I'm not grieving. But the
Okay.
truth is, everybody grieves. So,
Mm,
what's understanding about grief? Grief is what happens on the inside of us. It is an emotional and chemical response to an external loss. So,
mm,
when we talk about chemicals, we're talking about hormones that are within our bodies, in our brain. And the moment that grief hits us, it hits our brain and it causes these hormones, cortisol and norepinephrine and adrenaline. All of that is flooding through our bodies and it causes us to have an emotional response.
mm,
And that doesn't mean we necessarily express it on the outside because some people will say, you know what, I'm not a crier. Well, God made us with tear ducts. And if tears don't come out, there are two
mm,
reasons why. We're dealing with this medical condition called dry eye syndrome, or
mm,
we were taught to suppress and the tears
mm,
can't come up.
mm,
So that's a challenge, really just allowing people to acknowledge that they're in this space of grief and be okay with that and
mm.
then work through it.
Well, let me ask you something.
Mhm.
Is it possible can you have, well, let me ask it this way. Can you go through grief when it's not necessarily involving loved ones or somebody else? If it involves someone else, let me give you an example. For instance, I have deacons and I preach all kind of funerals. And at some point, it seems like you get to the point where it's just a, I want to say this right, it's just another funeral.
Mhm.
Am I saying that right?
You
And
said it right. You've grown
okay,
numb to it.
exactly.
Yes,
Is that possible?
absolutely it is.
Okay,
And many people experience that. That's called collective grief.
okay, okay.
When you as experience multiple losses at the same time, and so this is your ministry, your job to eulogize and do all of that. So you really haven't allowed yourself to feel and process. Because my one of my questions when you shared all of these things that you've done, especially here recently, and I'm thinking, I wonder what James is doing to take care of himself in this space to
Good,
continue to do that.
okay. Very good question.
Yeah, so
Very good question.
that is possible. A lot of people have grown numb to it, to grief because they've been around it so long
Okay. Okay. Well,
and not addressed it.
that helps. That helps.
Mhm,
So why don't you share for listeners of this podcast then your journey,
mhm.
into grief counseling?
Yes.
What motivated you to specialize in this field? Because I had a legal background, ministry background. I practiced law
Mhm,
for 10 years. Oh, my life has been a up and down. Doing well
mhm.
now, feel good. But
Good.
sometimes things get you to go in certain directions, and the journey takes you here and there. So,
Mhm.
how did you get into what you're doing? What
It
motivated you?
was Yeah, it was a divorce. It was.
Oh, okay.
As yeah, as human beings, we are creatures of habit. I
Hmm.
believe it is Newton's law of motion that teaches us. It says a
Hmm.
body at rest is going to stay at rest until
Hmm.
a greater force comes along and moves it out of the way.
Mm.
So many people will say, I want change. I want to lose weight or I want to get out of debt, but many are not willing to make the necessary changes to do that. So in our life, when it comes to grief, certain things in life will happen. So for me, it was a crisis of a divorce. So I was married to a pastor after
Mm.
9 years of marriage, and he decided to release himself from that covenant to be fully part of another part of a community,
Oh.
LGBTQ community. And
Hmm.
that experience really just sent me in a downward spiral into
Mm.
depression, and I was suicidal. Me, a minister of the gospel, I absolutely was. And the reason is because I only applied the spiritual application. I never dealt with my emotions.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
James, I admitted myself into the mental health hospital, and
Mm.
that's where my healing began. Actually, that's where
Wow.
I got reconnected with God.
Oh.
I didn't know
Yeah.
I was disconnected.
Something. It must have been some reason I have you on this podcast today.
Mhm,
I read your profile and I said, there's something about this profile that just hits me. I
mhm,
need this person on my podcast.
mhm.
So I practiced law for uh, 10 years, became a compulsive gambler, and committed a very serious crime. And
Uh-huh.
and because it was so unusual, they sent me to a mental hospital. So I stayed in the mental hospital for 3 weeks. And that was the turning point in my life. So
Mhm.
when you said it, I said, "Oh my God!"
Yes.
I felt it. I know exactly where you. It gave you that quiet time. It gave you that
Mhm.
reflection moment. It gave you a whole lot of
Yes.
time to just work through all that stuff. And when you know anything, your faith kicks in, and it's a totally different individuals. I feel you.
Absolutely. It
I
was the
truly
best
feel.
experience.
I truly
And I,
feel.
I share it. I tell people it was like I was Joseph.
Hmm.
Because when it talks about in the scripture repeatedly, it says, and the Lord was with him, and the
Hmm.
Lord was with Joseph, even
That's
in the
right.
mental health hospital.
Yeah, I know.
So yes.
I feel you. I feel you. Uh,
Hmm.
I don't know. I'm sitting here almost. I don't know. Let me stop because I'm supposed to be interviewing you. So
It is
let me.
okay.
Oh boy,
It is okay.
this is powerful. Uh, you know, why is personalized and guidance crucial to effective grief counseling, and how do you tailor your
Mm-hmm.
approach to meet each client's unique needs? Because to me, I'm sitting here thinking everybody grieve different. They're different
Mm-hmm.
clients. So what do you do to make it different, and how do you tell it to that particular individual?
Okay. So let me preface it by saying I'm so glad you made that statement because I used to say it as well, and many people say it as well, that, everybody grieves differently.
Mm.
Technically, we all grieve the same.
Okay.
We grieve the
Okay.
same because grief is what happens on the inside. Now we mourn differently. Grief and
Okay.
mourning are different. Mourning is
Okay.
that external expression of the grief that's on the inside.
Mm.
So, what I help people do is to identify you're in grief, and then I help them mourn properly. And to recognize also that grief is not about death, it is about loss of any
Mm.
kind. That's why it is true. Just before I hopped on with you, I got a text from Georgetown, Texas. Uh, they're wanting a speaker. They asked, would you be interested? We need you to come speak to the professors of color in light
Okay.
of the election because they're
Mhm.
experiencing grief.
Mm.
So all of us experience grief from a death loss or non-death loss. So when I see someone and I'm working with people, I have an intake process and I want to inquire about their losses. And then I ask them, do you think you processed that? And
Mhm.
most often, some will say yes, and then some will say, I probably haven't. But I just see where they are in their journey. And then I explain what is called the iceberg theory.
Mm.
An iceberg, we know that um, there's 10% of it that we see above sea level, but there's a whole 90% below sea level that we don't see. We're like the iceberg. So in grief, if there are losses of any kind that we have not processed and dealt with, they're going to
Mm.
rise to the surface when you have a current loss.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I basically just do an intake and assess them, see where they are. If this is a person that spiritualizes grief, if this is a person who has had counseling or therapy before, and tailor their needs. But basically, across the board, everybody gets the foundational teaching of what grief is, and we kind of go from there.
So for listeners of this podcast, you would
Mhm.
make one, you could say this with certainty, or make a definitive statement that there is a difference between grief and mourning.
Yes,
Okay, got you.
it
I need
is.
them to hear that. Okay,
Uh-huh.
okay. 'Cause
That's right.
sometimes we think it's the same thing, and
Hmm.
so I want to make sure that that's very clear. Now,
Yes, sir.
uh, one of the other things I want to ask you is based upon what my podcast is all about, and
Okay.
it's about encouraging, inspiring, and transforming.
Hmm.
I've listened to what you have said in this interview, and I'm thinking about listeners of this podcast who just may be going through something. They may have
Hmm.
lost a friend. They it could be some relatives. It could be just what I've just told you earlier when I was having a little fun. Their favorite
Hmm.
person that they voted for. It just they worked hard trying to
That's
get
right.
them elected, and then they didn't make it. This
Hmm.
that next day you wake up, you're not feeling like you ought
Absolutely.
to be. What would you say to them that will kind of give them at least some encouragement or inspire them a little
Mhm.
bit to not just fall completely into the pits?
Yes, I would encourage you by learning to perceive your pain from a different perspective.
Okay.
See it as a teacher.
Mm,
Grief is a teacher. It's all
okay.
about how we perceive that information because to get that transformation, we have to go through a process. There is something I share with people a lot, saying that there can be no transformation if there is no application
Mm,
of the information that we receive.
mm,
So, my encouragement is that none of us are too old to learn. As long as there's no cognitive deficit in our minds, you can learn. So I encourage you to learn about what's going on in your life and then seek out the proper help to help you navigate that space. Because a
okay.
lot of times I found people, especially in grief, attempting to navigate it alone
Hmm.
and grief can be isolating. So I want to encourage you that life is not over for you. I felt that same way when I
Okay.
went through divorce, middle age or late 40s,
Hmm.
almost 50. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is getting ready to happen? Life
Mm,
is not over. You
okay.
can always learn, and that's going to help you in your transformation.
Well, well said. Well said. Listeners, I hope y'all got that. Hold on for a moment, listeners. Don't go any place. I tell you, I'm having a great time talking with Tonya here. She's giving us some good information. So don't go to place because I need to ask Tonya to share with you, listeners, how you can contact her, whether she has a website,
Mhm,
book, or anything of that nature that
mhm.
you can benefit from. Would you take a moment and do that for us, Dr. Tanya?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My website is drtonyacunningham.com, drtonyacunningham.com. And on that, you can find my resources.
Okay.
I have books. I have my signature book I wrote when I was in the mental health hospital coming out. It's called I Got My Marbles Back.
Mm.
And
I love
yeah,
that one.
that's right. When we lose our mind, we've lost our marbles. So I got them back. I got them
Okay.
back. And
Okay.
so, yeah, I have that. And then I have grief work. And then I also published a children's book earlier this year and getting ready to publish another one. So you can find those resources there.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Listeners, I hope you hear that. Dr. Tanya, give us that website one more time. I want to make sure it sticks in their mind.
Sure. It is www.drtonyacunningham.com. And that's Tonya.com.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. I hope you all got that. Dr. Tanya,
Mhm.
uh, maybe you've already said this a little bit, but what advice do you have for someone who feels stuck in their grief and is kind of unsure how to move forward?
Mhm.
They just there
Mhm.
and they don't know where to go from there. I
Mhm.
dealt with a member in my church, the one that I pastored for 32 years,
Wow.
and she went through the grief for probably a full year more.
Mhm.
And I thought she had gotten stuck in it. She finally got out of it. You know, she finally was worked
Uh-huh.
herself out. So, what would you say? How would you? What can you say to them?
Well, I'm glad you shared the example because that helps me to share insight as well. It depends upon the type of loss that you had. Now,
Okay.
grief
Hmm.
never ends.
Okay.
Now, when people hear that, they think, oh, I'm going to be stuck in this pain forever. No.
Hmm.
I taught you all that grief is what happens on the inside, it's emotional response. That never ends, but the pain of it does.
Oh,
The
okay.
pain of grief should end. And so, and it depends upon the type of grief you're experiencing. If you had your 18-year-old child got shot versus your 98-year-old grandmother dying in her sleep, how you mourn and cope with those are going to be totally different because this 18-year-old would be what we call trauma and complicated grief. So you said she got stuck.
Uh-huh.
It takes up to 5 years after that loss to find your new normal,
Okay.
because the first year You're in shock about up to 9 months or more of that first year, trying to wrap your mind because the mind and the brain are not the same. Our mind tells our brain what to do, and then our brain tells our body what to do. So, one of the revelations I got that God gave me is that's why the Bible speaks so much about the mind,
Mm-hmm.
because that's how we serve the Lord. And what does the enemy go after? Our mind.
Mm.
So, the thought processing, a healthy brain and a healthy mind will reject death and dying. So it's a greater part of that year, within the 9 months of that year, that she was just trying to wrap the fact around that my husband died, my husband died, my husband died. So you're really stuck if it's 5 years beyond.
Oh,
Anywhere from
okay.
3 to 5 years beyond, you can get stuck in it.
Okay.
But you're really working through and navigating because life is never the same, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
Life is never the same after loss. So you're navigating, trying to figure out, okay, who am I now without that person?
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Makes a lot of sense. So you were saying that if it goes beyond 5 years, then you may be stuck. So how would somebody get from under that?
And then the to acknowledge that
Okay.
I'm stuck.
Okay.
Yeah, because most people don't. An example, I went to go speak to a group of people last week, and an employee stated, "Oh, that's right. My brother's sister, their daughter died 20 years ago. And to
Hmm.
this day, anytime that daughter's name is brought up, she leaves the room. She can't talk about it. She's
Oh,
stuck in
wow.
it.
Oh,
So she
wow.
hasn't dealt with that. We we
Okay.
we can't heal until we feel. So
Okay.
that's an example of a person where I mean they're stuck.
Yeah. And so if you're in that position, you just can't assume it's going to go away. You're going to have to deal with it one way or the other.
Absolutely.
Okay.
If
All
you
right.
don't deal with your grief, it will deal with you.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I got you. Well, um, I am a couple more questions I want to just ask you. Then I'm gonna kind of cut this loose. How can an individual balance the grief with daily responsibilities and commitments? You got all these
Mm-hmm.
commitments, you got all these responsibilities you're dealing with, but yet you're
Mm-hmm.
still going through this stuff. Now,
Mm-hmm.
your spouse passed, uh, and you got to deal with all of these responsibilities. You got to pay the bills, you got to do this, but yet and still, you know,
Yeah.
you are stuck in this grief. I don't like use the word stuck all the time, but
Yeah.
you're going through this grief.
Yeah.
How can they balance that?
Very, very real scenario that most of us, again, we go through. I call it the business of grief versus the emotionality of grief.
Mm,
Many have to make life decisions. I'm going to have to leave because one income has died because my spouse died. I
mm,
do have to pay the bills. If I
mhm,
have other children, I got to feed the kids. And so you have all these things to do. So the very first thing I encourage you to do is, first of all, be gracious and kind to yourself, meaning realizing that you can't do it all, especially in this place when your mind and your heart is injured by grief.
mm,
So don't try to do what I call performance, because that's a sign of a trauma response, because some of us are used to going, 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 serving, 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 and never taking care of our bodies. So
mhm.
recognize, give grace to yourself. Second thing, delegate. Delegate some of those responsibilities to people that you trust. Prayerfully, you do have at least one person that you can help,
Mhm.
or that can help you through this journey. Because the truth is, many people think that they can, and they become more of a burden to a person in grief because they're putting undue pressure on them that they should be, quote unquote, better than they are right now, especially
Okay.
a person of faith.
Okay.
We, a lot of that, we're told as people of faith, just be strong. And
Hmm.
that's not even biblically sound, because the word of the Lord tells us, again, his strength is made perfect
Yeah, yeah,
in our
yeah,
weakness.
yeah. I just
So
preached that.
learning to be, You
I
just
just
preached that?
I just preached that the other Sunday. My grace is sufficient. It's right in
That's
that
it.
text. Right in that
That's
text.
it.
Yeah, yeah. So
That's it.
I
So
know who you
learning to
are.
be vulnerable.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Well, my last question to you. I know you've done this quite a few times.
Mm.
You have gone. Obviously, you told me you just got a text while we were talking, and a little before we came on.
Yeah.
So obviously, you have helped many folks along the line. So tell listeners of this podcast, what are the most impactful changes individuals report to you after working with you as their grief coach?
Two always come to mind. One, when I released my first book, I was working in hospice then, and she was a Caucasian lady Methodist. She
Hmm.
came to me the next day after my book signing and said, "Teach me about this Jesus that you talk about." Because I
Mm,
mentioned I'm a person of faith, and I talked about my journey, but it is faith based. But I talk
mm,
about the natural and the spiritual.
mm,
So she came to Christ. She said, "They don't teach about that in my church. Can you
mm,
teach me? I want to know him." And then the
mm,
second one is my poster. I call him my poster boy. But he was 89 when I met him. 92. He just died at the top of this year. His wife died. He was Hispanic male. I give his cultures because their culture is similar to the Black community. We're not going to deal with our emotions. We're just going to sweep it under the rug. He did that when his wife died. They were married about 60 years, so much so that it made him sick. He had to go to the hospital because he was paralyzed. He went to get up out of the bed one day and couldn't. And the doctor ran tests, said everything was fine, came and asked him the magic question: "What's going on in your life?" And
mm,
he said what most people do: "Nothing." And the doctor said, "Oh no, your body is responding." So he was dying of a broken heart.
mm,
That man came back to my group and he said, "Young lady, I'm going to start applying what you're teaching in this grief group. I don't know if you can teach this old dog new tricks, but I'm here to learn." And
mm.
he taught me that, yeah,
Wow.
you can learn. Our age doesn't mean that we can't. And so he lived 4 more years thriving.
Wow.
He
That
just
Tonya,
died this year.
you're awesome. I've enjoyed this interview. You're awesome.
I've enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'm certain listeners of this podcast will really benefit from what you said to us today. And
Thank
again,
you.
thank you so very much. And there you have it, Dr. Tonya Cunningham sharing with us today. And until next time, peace and blessings be with each of you.